On 15 September 1940, a heavy stillness hung over the cabinet chamber inside the Japanese Prime Minister's residence in Tokyo. Cigarette smoke drifted in wavering layers above the long conference table, giving the room a dim, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, seated among the nation's senior leaders, quietly crushed the end of another American-manufactured cigarette, a small but unmissable reminder of the very industrial power Japan was contemplating. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe, abandoning the elaborate courtesy that normally shaped high-level political discussions, chose directness over ritual. Dispensing with euphemisms, he addressed Yamamoto with the question that had lingered unspoken in previous meetings. If Japan ends up in a war against the United States, what should we realistically foresee? Yamamoto's reply unsettled nearly everyone in the room, and would later be remembered as one of the starkest assessments delivered by a Japanese military commander before the Pacific War. If I am ordered to engage in combat, I can act without hindrance for perhaps 6 months, possibly a little longer. After that, I have no confidence in our prospects. The words produced an immediate, palpable shift. Tense shoulders stiffened, papers rustled, and the chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Those present understood that this was not a rhetorical caution. It was the judgment of the officer most likely to oversee Japan's opening operations in any conflict. Yet few realized that Yamamoto was not speculating. His conclusion rested on years of direct observation, detailed study, and unromantic arithmetic.
During his earlier tours in the United States, Yamamoto had walked through sprawling naval yards, inspected modern steelworks, examined oil production and refining plants, and reviewed industrial output statistics with professional rigor. From these examinations, he had formed a clear strategic picture. Once American economic strength was fully mobilized, Japan could not hope to keep pace. Long before Pearl Harbor, in Yamamoto's view, the eventual outcome of a prolonged contest had already been written. The only question was how long Japan could delay the inevitable. Origins of a cautious strategist. Isoroku, born Isoroku Takano on April 4, 1884 in the city of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture, came into a household marked by modest means. His father, a schoolteacher nearing his late 50s, named his son after his own age, Isoroku, or 56. The family's economic situation was precarious enough that meals were often built around inexpensive staples like barley or sweet potatoes. White rice appeared only on special occasions. These early experiences with scarcity contributed to Yamamoto's later awareness of the enormous imbalance between Japanese resources and the industrial wealth of the United States. In 1916, the young officer was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a customary arrangement within Japanese society that could enhance one's career prospects and social standing. By that stage, he had already survived severe injuries suffered during the 1905 Battle of Tsushima, including the loss of 2 fingers on his left hand. The battle was celebrated domestically as a vindication of national spirit and resolve, but Yamamoto interpreted it differently. Russia, he understood, had been weakened by internal turmoil and geographic overextension. The United States would enter a conflict with neither of those disadvantages. These experiences, childhood poverty, first-hand knowledge of modern warfare, and a methodical appraisal of American industrial capability shaped Yamamoto's later warnings. By 1940, when he addressed Kono and the cabinet, he was not offering pessimism, but presenting a sober calculation grounded in evidence he had gathered long before the Pacific War began. Isoroku Yamamoto's assessment of Japan's strategic position required more than theoretical study. To evaluate firsthand the nation he suspected Japan might someday confront, he was dispatched in 1919, then a 35-year-old officer, to the United States for language training and academic observation at Harvard University. When he arrived in Cambridge, clad in ceremonial naval attire and carrying the traditional swords that signaled his rank, he drew immediate notice among the campus crowds. Officially, he was enrolled to improve his English, yet the most consequential part of his stay unfolded outside the classroom. His formal grades were modest, but Yamamoto increasingly diverted his efforts toward independent investigation. He rented a simple room in nearby Brookline and adopted a demanding routine that bordered on self-imposed austerity. Sleep occupied only a small portion of each night. The remaining hours were devoted to studying the technical foundations of American strength. He filled his room with statistical surveys, industrial reports, engineering manuals, and maps that charted the geographic distribution of U.S. resources. Petroleum extraction, steel output, shipbuilding methods, and the newly expanding aviation sector received his closest attention. Much of this research took place at Harvard's Widener Library, where he sifted through government publications and economic analyses. One figure in particular left a lasting impression. In 1919, the United States accounted for roughly 2/3 of global oil production, about 378 million barrels. Japan, by contrast, possessed no comparable reserves and depended almost entirely on imports, often from the same country it considered a potential adversary. The traditional academic calendar proved to be only a starting point. When summer arrived, Yamamoto set aside university obligations and embarked on solitary journeys across the American mainland. He often traveled with minimal funds, hitchhiking long distances, staying wherever shelter could be found, barns, open fields, or empty structures abandoned along rural roads. These frugal trips allowed him to observe industrial America at close range. His first extended expedition brought him to Texas, where he spent weeks walking through oil fields and refinery sites. Seeing drilling rigs and pipelines stretch across the landscape offered a scale of resource development that far exceeded anything familiar to him in Japan. The experience strengthened a conclusion he would later express repeatedly. Japan might deliver swift blows in the early stages of a conflict, but it lacked the industrial depth necessary for a prolonged struggle against the United States. Yamamoto's investigations continued the following summer. In 1920, he traveled to Detroit, having covered nearly 900 miles from Cambridge by catching rides from passing motorists. His immediate goal was simply to observe the end-of-shift crowd leaving the Ford Highland Park factory. Close to 20,000 workers streamed out, many heading directly toward their own cars. For Yamamoto, accustomed to a society where private automobiles were still a luxury, even this gathering of ordinary workers represented a profound marker of American wealth and mass production. Using the pretext of being an engineering student, he managed to secure entry into the Highland Park facility. What he encountered inside redefined his understanding of manufacturing. The plant's moving assembly line produced a Model T approximately every 45 seconds. Each laborer executed a narrowly defined task, and the cumulative effect was a near-continuous flow of completed vehicles. The transformation from raw materials to a finished automobile required less than 2 hours. Over several days, Yamamoto filled multiple notebooks with detailed sketches, calculations, and observations. He noted that Ford's workforce outnumbered the entire enlisted strength of the Japanese Navy, and that the plant's daily consumption of steel exceeded Japan's weekly national output. More unsettling still was the realization that this immense operation represented only one facility in one American city. In a reflective letter to his mentor, Admiral Thomas Aburo Yamamoto, Yamamoto summarized the lesson he had drawn from his travels. He wrote that American factories operated with a precision normally associated with scientific experimentation. Industrial labor, he observed, was organized with a degree of efficiency and methodical planning that Japan typically reserved for agricultural management. Tasks were analyzed, divided, and refined with relentless attention to eliminating waste. The capacity for production appeared not only vast, but systematically optimized. The figures underlying what Yamamoto witnessed were as astonishing as the scenes themselves. American automobile production, for example, had exploded from fewer than 500,000 vehicles in 1915 to well over 2 million by 1920. By the time Yamamoto toured the country, the United States effectively possessed a car for every 13 people, a level of motorization unmatched anywhere else in the world. Japan, by comparison, had an ownership ratio closer to 1 automobile for every 5,000 citizens. Yet Yamamoto's insight did not stop at civilian affluence. He grasped immediately that the same industrial systems capable of manufacturing millions of passenger cars could, with minimal adjustment, mass-produce trucks for troop transport, components for armored vehicles, and engines for military aircraft. The American workforce, trained for high-precision assembly line work, represented a ready-made reserve of skilled labor that could be redirected toward wartime production. And the immense supplier networks feeding Detroit formed the backbone of a logistical machine that could be repurposed with astonishing speed. In 1921, before completing his Harvard studies, Yamamoto embarked on another unapproved expedition, this time into the American Southwest. For nearly a month and a half, he traveled without informing diplomatic officials, causing mild concern when he failed to appear at scheduled functions. His true interest lay in the oil fields of East Texas, which he believed contained the real measure of American strategic potential. Using whatever means of transportation he could find, freight trains, long hikes along rural roads, occasional rides obtained from passing motorists, he made his way to Spindletop, near Beaumont, the site of the enormous 1901 gusher that had ignited the petroleum era. Although the initial frenzy had long passed, the field continued to yield thousands of barrels each day. Yamamoto spent hours interviewing drillers, geologists, and refinery technicians, recording details about drilling pressures, extraction equipment, and refining processes. What struck him most was the scale. A single Texas well, he noted, could produce in one day what Japan required more than a week to import. At Port Arthur, he observed the enormous Texaco complex, which refined roughly 100,000 barrels every day. The facility ran continuously, its operations driven by electric power systems and pumps fully automated by the standards of the early 1920s. In his diary, Yamamoto wrote that petroleum had become the decisive resource of modern warfare, fuel for fleets, aircraft, armored vehicles, and supply convoys, and that the United States possessed reserves on a scale Japan could not hope to match. This fact alone, he concluded, determines the boundaries of strategy. From the Gulf Coast, he traveled north to the newly booming fields around Kilgore and Longview. There, he encountered an industrial landscape that bordered on the chaotic. Oil derricks rose so densely that laborers joked a person could cross the area without ever touching the ground. Waste gas burned ceaselessly from flare stacks, lighting the surrounding countryside through the night. To Yamamoto, the extravagance bordered on surreal. While Japan carefully rationed every imported gallon, Americans were venting enough natural gas each day to power the entire Tokyo metropolitan area for weeks. It was this near-careless abundance, more than parades, war games, or naval demonstrations, that convinced him of the enduring strength the United States could marshal in any future conflict. Yamamoto returned to America in early 1926 as a full naval captain, assigned as Japan's naval attaché in Washington. His new post, which lasted until March 1928, allowed him to evaluate American capabilities with far more authority and freedom. Now equipped with a government budget, official recognition, and open access to industrial sites, he set out to scrutinize the country's productive power with methodical precision. He quickly realized that the United States had expanded dramatically since his initial visit. Automobile manufacturing had risen to nearly 4.3 million vehicles annually. Steel production had climbed to 48 million tons. Petroleum output had passed 770 million barrels per year. The pace of growth was not merely steady, it was accelerating. Yamamoto settled into a strict weekly pattern. From Monday through Wednesday, he remained in Washington, fulfilling diplomatic responsibilities, attending naval conferences, and maintaining formal ties. Each Thursday, he boarded a train and departed for industrial centers across the nation, often returning only late Sunday. His interests rarely varied: production capacity, raw material availability, and the technologies enabling American efficiency. At the Bethlehem Steel Works in Pennsylvania, he toured the facilities where armor plate for battleships was forged. There he witnessed electric furnaces producing high-grade steels in a fraction of the time required by Japanese manufacturers. The complex employed around 30,000 workers and consumed more electrical power than the entire city of Kyoto, an illustration of American energy resources that deeply impressed him. In Birmingham, Alabama, he traced the supply chain that sustained American heavy industry: iron ore from Minnesota, coal from the Appalachian region, limestone from Indiana. These materials were transported across vast distances by rail networks, directed through communication systems, telegraph and telephone exchanges, more advanced than Japan's most sophisticated industrial coordination tools. During these Washington years, Yamamoto also became known for the Friday evening poker games he hosted in his apartment. Guests included American naval officers, foreign diplomats, and members of U.S. naval intelligence. The gatherings seemed casual: whiskey, cards, and polite conversation, but they served an additional purpose. As Captain Ellis Zacharias later recounted in his 1946 memoir, Secret Missions, participants on both sides used the relaxed environment to gauge one another's naval practices, doctrinal thinking, and informal insights into ship performance. What appeared to be friendly recreation doubled as a subtle form of mutual intelligence testing. Commander Ellis M. Zacharias later described Isoroku Yamamoto as an opponent who approached poker with the same precision he brought to strategic planning. Yamamoto tracked every card that left the deck, calculated probabilities with startling speed, and observed even minor changes in posture or expression from the players around him. For him, however, the true value of these evenings was not the money on the table, but the informal psychological research that the game made possible. Through these sessions, he studied how American officers confronted uncertainty, how readily they bet, how they adjusted when stakes rose, and how they behaved after a loss. Poker, in Yamamoto's assessment, revealed an essential aspect of American strategic culture. Boldness was affordable because the United States possessed the material depth to recover from failure. Japan, whose industrial and financial reserves were far more limited, could not replace heavy losses with the same ease.
One cold night in February 1926, after winning a sizable pot, Yamamoto articulated this contrast in a remark that Zacharias remembered for decades. Whether at the card table or in a conflict, advantage belongs to the side with the larger reserve. Japan is gambling with borrowed capital. The United States owns the vault. Even in these seemingly casual gatherings, Yamamoto's thinking about future warfare continued to sharpen. His most consequential insight during his years in America concerned the shifting center of naval power. While many admirals in Tokyo still regarded battleships as the backbone of maritime strength, Yamamoto became convinced that aviation, especially carrier-borne aircraft, extended-range strike capability, and air superiority would define the coming era. By the mid-1920s,
The United States had positioned itself at the front of this technological transformation. No longer was the nation's security anchored primarily in battleship fleets or coastal fortifications. The decisive arena was moving upward into the sky. As a naval attaché assigned to Washington, Yamamoto had a unique vantage point from which to observe the new reality. One of his earliest technical visits took him to the Glenn L. Martin Company outside Cleveland, Ohio. There he saw an aircraft plant that looked more like an extension of the automobile industry than a traditional aviation workshop. Production lines followed an assembly logic inspired by Detroit's auto factories. Workers, many of whom had never seen an aircraft engine before joining the company, were trained rapidly to perform complex tasks with electric tools at fixed stations. Conveyor systems kept parts in constant circulation, and the plant completed roughly 6 aircraft every day, a production rhythm far beyond anything then possible in Japan. From Cleveland, Yamamoto traveled to McCook Field in Dayton, an experimental center that would eventually evolve into Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The scale of American aeronautical research astonished him. McCook's staff of engineers exceeded Japan's national total for the entire aviation sector. Laboratories tested new alloys, engines underwent continuous evaluation, and wind tunnels conducted aerodynamic studies at a pace that made Japan's research infrastructure seem rudimentary by comparison. The statistics reinforced what he observed. In 1926, American factories built 1,186 military aircraft and an additional 5,789 civilian airplanes, supporting a coast-to-coast commercial aviation network for both passengers and mail. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to manufacture even 200 aircraft annually, and many of those depended on imported engines and precision instruments. In a dispatch to the Navy Ministry, Yamamoto summarized his impressions with a succinct warning. American planners operate in 3 dimensions, while we continue to concentrate on perfecting surface engagements. They have already advanced to a new stage of warfare. For him, the United States was not merely producing aircraft. It was assembling the entire industrial ecosystem necessary for air supremacy. A reliable supply of aluminum, ongoing engine innovation, and assembly lines capable of generating fleets rather than individual prototypes.
Despite the clarity of his reports, the reaction in Tokyo was muted. The senior leadership remained committed to the traditional doctrine of a decisive surface battle, envisioning an epic confrontation between opposing battleship formations. Aircraft carriers, in their view, were auxiliary assets suited mainly for reconnaissance. The most comprehensive portion of Yamamoto's American study unfolded during the summer of 1926, when he undertook an extensive tour of major industrial centers. Using his diplomatic credentials and the network of contacts he had carefully built, he gained access to facilities rarely opened to foreign observers. Each visit provided more evidence for his growing conviction that American industrial strength could overwhelm Japan in any long conflict. The most revealing of these excursions brought him to the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan. The plant, covering nearly 2,000 acres, operated as a self-contained industrial metropolis. Raw materials arrived directly by ship or rail, iron ore from northern mines, coal from the interior, and natural rubber transported from Firestone plantations in Liberia. Inside Rouge, these materials moved through every stage of production: ore to steel, sand to glass, raw rubber to finished components, all the way to final vehicle assembly on vast lines operating with clockwork precision. Roughly 100,000 employees worked within the complex, which generated its own electrical power from a system capable of producing 400,000 horsepower. For Yamamoto, River Rouge represented more than a factory. It demonstrated how the United States could convert natural resources into finished products at a speed and scale that no Japanese industrial district could hope to match. It was one more confirmation of the strategic dilemma he had already begun to outline. Japan might fight brilliantly, but it could not outproduce an opponent whose industrial infrastructure functioned almost like a nation unto itself. The scale of American industrial production left Yamamoto momentarily overwhelmed, despite the fact that he had studied its dimensions on paper long before setting foot inside the facilities. Nothing in the reports he had read quite equaled the sensation of walking beneath blast furnaces that illuminated the sky at all hours, or watching assembly lines extend so far that they seemed to merge with the horizon. Parking lots packed with tens of thousands of automobiles, more than entire Japanese prefectures possessed collectively, gave him a direct, almost physical sense of the economic force the United States could bring to bear. His next stop, the Bayway refinery, operated by Standard Oil in New Jersey, reinforced this impression. There he observed petroleum processing on a level Japan could not dream of matching. Roughly 100,000 barrels of crude moved through the plant every day, transformed into aviation fuel, lubricants, and the chemical precursors that supported numerous American industries. The refinery's relatively new catalytic cracking systems dramatically increased gasoline yields, ensuring a steady supply of the high-performance fuel that modern aircraft required. Japan's smaller refineries, scattered and technologically behind, could not produce anything approaching such volumes. After touring the facility, Yamamoto recorded a private reflection. This nation has mastered the mathematics of industrial warfare. Limitless raw materials, enormous productive machinery, and an uninterrupted stream of technological advances. Together, these guarantee strategic endurance. Japan lacks all three in any significant degree. Later, in 1926, Yamamoto headed west on official orders to attend a naval gathering in San Francisco. In practice, however, the trip doubled as an extended reconnaissance mission. Each port, shipyard, and industrial zone he examined contributed to a larger portrait of a country preparing, sometimes consciously, sometimes by the natural momentum of its economy, for a modern conflict in which production capacity mattered as much as military doctrine. The American West Coast, which he had last seen in his youth, had transformed profoundly. The Mares Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, already capable of constructing and overhauling major warships simultaneously, possessed an electrical output surpassing that of all Japanese naval yards combined. Around the wider San Francisco Bay, he found layers of logistical infrastructure, depots, workshops, dry docks, communication nodes, functioning together in a way Japan had not yet achieved. Continuing south, Yamamoto examined the rapidly expanding aviation industries centered in Los Angeles. The Douglas Aircraft Company, still a young firm by industrial standards, was producing advanced airframes based on stressed skin construction techniques unfamiliar to most Japanese designers. Inside its design offices worked hundreds of engineers experimenting with aerodynamic and structural concepts Japan would not adopt for years. Yamamoto recognized that American innovation in the air was not a distant threat, it was developing in real time. Yet the feature of Southern California that impressed him most deeply was its petroleum landscape. The Los Angeles basin contained more than 20 major oil-producing districts. At Signal Hill, drilling rigs were so closely packed that they formed what looked like a metallic forest. California's annual production, around 230 million barrels, was so immense that Japan would have needed roughly 5 wartime years to consume an equivalent amount. The region's ports conveyed the same message. San Pedro and Long Beach, upgraded with electrified cranes and mechanized cargo systems, could move more freight through a single berth in one day than Tokyo's port could manage in an entire week.
For sustaining long-distance operations across the Pacific, the American side already possessed the necessary infrastructure. Japan did not.
Warnings ignored. Upon returning to Japan in March 1928, Yamamoto compiled his findings into a detailed report of roughly 200 pages. Had its contents been fully absorbed, it might have extinguished the remaining illusions within the Japanese government that a war with the United States could be won. His conclusions were direct and left no room for misunderstanding. American industry surpassed Japan's output by factors ranging from 10 to 20. The United States produced 100 times the petroleum Japan used. American steel production exceeded Japan's by a ratio of 12 to 1. U.S. automobile factories demonstrated a model of mass production that could be immediately redirected to arms manufacturing. Aeronautical research in America was accelerating at a pace far beyond anything Japan could match. It was, in effect, a strategic warning delivered years before war seemed imminent. Yet Tokyo's military leadership, committed to its own assumptions about fighting spirit and a decisive battle, treated Yamamoto's findings as interesting but not urgent. The disparity he had witnessed across the American continent, raw material reserves, engineering capacity, industrial integration, was left largely unaddressed, even as the gap continued to widen. Yamamoto returned to his duties aware that the most important conclusions of his American study had not taken root. The industrial imbalance he had observed firsthand would later define the Pacific War, just as his calculations had predicted. Although the implications of Yamamoto's analysis were profound, his report met a quiet bureaucratic end. It was classified without ceremony and placed in the archives, consulted only for the portions relevant to American naval construction. The broader economic evaluation, precisely the section Yamamoto considered most consequential, was dismissed by senior officers as unrelated to maritime doctrine. The Army, absorbed in its continental ambitions and focused on operations in China, showed no interest whatsoever in warnings about the United States. As the years passed, Yamamoto's position within the military establishment became increasingly precarious. Rather than viewing his first-hand knowledge of America as a strategic asset, many colleagues interpreted his experiences as signs of ideological contamination. His taste for American-style coffee, the brand of cigarettes he preferred, and even his habit of keeping up with U.S. journals fueled rumors that he had drifted away from Japanese values. A sustained whisper campaign depicted him as a man whose loyalty had been compromised by foreign influence. Despite this growing hostility, he continued to press his arguments. Through lectures at naval schools, articles in internal publications, and direct conversations with junior commanders, he repeatedly emphasized a prediction he believed undeniable. Japan could not endure a long confrontation with the United States. The problem, he explained, had little to do with courage or tactical skill. American industry thrived on constant innovation, supported by abundant raw materials and flexible management. Japan's economic structure, limited in resources and constrained by social hierarchy, lacked the agility required for sustained modernization. Becoming a target. By the late 1930s, Yamamoto's persistence carried real danger. Radical nationalist circles within the army, groups that had already orchestrated multiple assassinations of political and military leaders, identified him as an obstacle to their expansionist agenda. To these extremists, his assertion that war with the United States would end in catastrophe amounted to defeatism and, ultimately, betrayal. Recognizing the threat to Yamamoto's life, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai intervened. Yonai privately shared Yamamoto's assessment of American capabilities
and understood how vulnerable he was in Tokyo, where extremist officers operated with few constraints. To protect him, Yonai arranged for Yamamoto's reassignment far from the capital. On 30 August 1939, Yamamoto was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The transfer was intended not as a promotion, but as a safeguard. Ironically, the very position designed to remove him from political danger placed him in charge of the naval arm that would initiate any conflict with the United States. Yamamoto recognized the paradox immediately. Writing to his friend Yoshida, he compared the situation to treating a patient determined to incur a fatal wound. A physician could slow the decline, he noted, but could not reverse a decision already made. Final warnings before the storm. His resistance did not ease with his new command. When Japan considered entering the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940, Yamamoto warned bluntly that the agreement would almost certainly lead to confrontation with the United States. In conversations with Prime Minister Kono, he phrased the matter with clinical simplicity. Japan might enjoy short-term success, but the window of advantage would close within roughly a year. Only weeks later, in October 1940, he presented an even sharper forecast to Navy Minister Admiral Koshiro Oikawa. During the first months of a conflict, he said, he could deliver rapid and decisive operations. After 6 months, however, he could promise no further advantage. The industrial imbalance was too great. Eventually, American production would overwhelm any tactical brilliance Japan could muster. Through every avenue available to him, Yamamoto repeated a single theme. Choosing war with the United States meant entering a contest already decided by the mathematics of industrial capacity.
A defining contradiction emerged in early 1941. In January, despite years of cautioning against such a conflict, Yamamoto received orders to design Japan's opening offensive. The admiral, who had spent 2 decades warning of America's inexhaustible resources, was now instructed to craft a plan capable of neutralizing them. His strategy rested entirely on what he had learned during his American travels. He believed the United States' weak point was not its material resources, but its psychological posture. Protected by distance and accustomed to national security, Americans did not anticipate a sudden blow. A dramatic, unexpected strike, he reasoned, might shock Washington into negotiating before its enormous industrial arsenal could be fully mobilized. The idea was rooted in desperation rather than optimism. Tokyo hoped to incapacitate the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough to secure Japan's advance into Southeast Asia. More crucially, policymakers hoped Americans would decide that a prolonged war was not worth the sacrifice. Even as Yamamoto shaped the details of the attack, he viewed the larger outcome as predetermined. He trusted his pilots to inflict devastating damage at Pearl Harbor. What he doubted was Japan's ability to withstand the industrial retaliation that would follow. He had studied the factories that could replace lost ships, the oil reserves that would power American fleets, and the manufacturing systems capable of turning out aircraft and warships at scales beyond Japanese reach. In his eyes, Pearl Harbor would be a tactical masterstroke, but a strategic disaster, precisely what he confided to those close to him. As 1941 progressed and diplomatic avenues narrowed, Yamamoto's warnings sharpened. When younger officers boasted of Japan's fighting spirit, he countered with numerical comparisons that stripped sentiment from the discussion. For every ton of oil Japan possessed, the United States held hundreds of thousands. American steel production dwarfed Japan's by an almost incomprehensible margin. Its factories could be retooled in a matter of weeks to manufacture weapons at extraordinary speed. From Yamamoto's perspective, the war's conclusion was already visible long before its first battles. The only uncertainty was when, rather than how, the inevitable would unfold.
In September of that year, Yamamoto returned to Nagaoka to speak before the newest graduates of his former academy. What they heard from him that day was startlingly frank, arguably one of the most unguarded public evaluations of American potential ever delivered by a senior Japanese naval officer. He reminded the audience that a widespread belief had taken root in Japan, that Americans were complacent, softened by prosperity, undisciplined, and lacking in determination. Such assumptions, he warned, were illusions that could lead Japan into catastrophic miscalculation. His own time in the United States had convinced him that Americans were neither idle nor timid. They were curious, adaptive, and exceptionally bold. Their scientific culture encouraged experimentation. Their industries embraced machinery and automation on a scale Japan had not yet matched. Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, he noted, was the kind of daring act Americans viewed not as improbable, but as an expected expression of national spirit. He reminded the cadets that the United States commanded industrial resources far beyond Japan's capacity and possessed an essentially unlimited supply of petroleum, Japan's most critical deficiency. There is no attainable scenario in which Japan can triumph over the United States, he told them bluntly. Avoiding confrontation is the only rational course. The auditorium fell silent, the young listeners unprepared for such a sober message in place of the patriotic rhetoric they had anticipated. His letters were even more severe. Writing privately to Chiyo Kawai, Yamamoto complained that Japan's leaders had fostered a dangerously false picture of the United States as fractured and easily intimidated. He stressed that he had seen the country at ground level and understood its true capability. Going to war with America, he argued, was like an insect challenging a giant creature, a decision that could only end in national ruin. When hostilities finally commenced, the initial outcome surpassed the Japanese Navy's most optimistic forecasts. At Pearl Harbor, 8 American battleships were rendered unusable, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed before they could take off. Casualties were staggering by American standards, totaling more than 2,000 dead. Japan's own losses were minimal in comparison, fewer than 30 aircraft, 5 miniature submarines, and 64 personnel. Across the Japanese home islands, the reaction bordered on euphoria. Citizens poured into the streets, convinced that Japan had decisively humbled a decadent superpower.
Aboard the battleship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, Yamamoto observed the situation very differently. He accepted the reports without outward emotion, and when his subordinates began celebrating with sake, he quietly removed himself from the gathering and retreated to his quarters. Hours later, Admiral Motome Ugaki found him poring over maps of the Pacific, already contemplating the next phase rather than delighting in the moment. In later decades, Hollywood would popularize the dramatic phrase about rousing a sleeping giant. Yamamoto never uttered those words. His genuine comment, sent to Agata Subura, was far less theatrical. He wrote that no commander could take real satisfaction from attacking an enemy caught unaware. What mattered, he insisted, was how that enemy reacted after recovering from the initial shock. And he harbored no doubts that the United States, once angered and mobilized, would fight with relentless determination. What unsettled him most was not the failure to destroy the American aircraft carriers, although that was tactically serious, but rather the untouched infrastructure at Pearl Harbor. The enormous fuel depots, dry docks, and repair facilities remained fully functional. From his earlier visits to American naval centers, Yamamoto knew exactly how swiftly the U.S. Navy could rebuild. The losses appeared devastating, but were, in practical terms, only temporary. Equally damaging was the diplomatic fiasco in Washington. Yamamoto had repeatedly insisted on ensuring that a formal declaration of war reached the Americans before the attack. Due to bungling at the Japanese embassy, the message was delivered too late. Instead of viewing the strike as a conventional opening to war, The United States interpreted it as a treacherous assault, destroying any chance of negotiation. Quote, "I had hoped we might conduct a war of honor. Instead, we have condemned ourselves to fight under the shadow of disgrace." End quote. For roughly half a year, Japan advanced almost without interruption. The Imperial Navy swept across the Pacific, claiming territory at a pace that stunned the world. Singapore capitulated. Allied forces were overwhelmed in the Philippines. The resource-rich Dutch East Indies fell soon after. By the spring of 1942, Tokyo presided over a far-flung empire stretching from the Indian Ocean to the central Pacific Islands. Yet Yamamoto treated these victories with no sense of triumph. He regarded them not as signs of durable success, but as the predictable consequence of striking before the United States had fully mobilized. To him, these rapid gains were merely the prelude to an unavoidable contest of industrial strength, a contest Japan was destined to lose. Within his cabin aboard the flagship, he began assembling a growing catalog of American naval construction statistics. The numbers were sobering even at this early stage. During the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U.S. shipyards launched 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, nearly 24 destroyers, and more than 20 submarines. And he understood these deliveries represented only the beginning. Many American industrial centers were still scaling up operations. Once at peak capacity, they would produce warships at a rate that Japan's Navy could not possibly counter. The petroleum situation painted an equally ominous picture. Although Japan had seized the Dutch East Indies and their valuable oil fields, the combined production of these captured territories could not come close to matching American output. In a single 30-day period, the United States pumped more oil than Japan's new holdings yielded in an entire year. Compounding the disparity was the United States' progress in synthetic rubber production, an innovation Yamamoto had studied years earlier. This meant the U.S. war effort would not be constrained even if traditional sources of natural rubber were lost.
To one of his operations officers, he offered a bleak metaphor. "We are like children who have stolen sweets. For a moment, we enjoy the taste, but we forget the punishment that inevitably follows." The turning point arrived on June 4, 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, when the Battle of Midway began. Japan's plan was elaborate, involving dispersed forces and carefully timed maneuvers, perhaps reflecting Yamamoto's awareness that the empire might not get a second chance to cripple the remaining American carriers before reinforcements surged from U.S. shipyards. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans had no more than 2 operational carriers in the region. The reality was more dire. 3 U.S. carriers awaited the Japanese advance, and American codebreakers had already penetrated key elements of Japan's operational communications. The disaster that overtook the Imperial Japanese Navy unfolded with a kind of grim, mechanical certainty, as if the outcome had been derived from an unassailable formula. In the span of a single afternoon, 4 of Japan's core carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were eliminated in succession. Their loss was not merely a tactical setback, it represented a strategic collapse. Japan lacked both the industrial momentum to construct new fleet carriers at comparable speed and the trained air crews required to bring such vessels into effective service. Far behind the battle area, on board the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received each message from Midway with an outward calm that startled his staff. When the final confirmation arrived that every major carrier engaged in the operation had been destroyed, he offered only a slight nod. Officers later recalled the impression that he was not shocked, but rather absorbing the official verdict of a decline he had long foreseen. "The American giant is fully awake now," he reportedly told those around him. "From here on, we can only delay what can no longer be prevented." The production figures that followed in the months after Midway heartened this assessment.
Over the next year and a half, the United States brought into commission 17 new fleet carriers and 76 escort carriers, an expansion unparalleled in naval history. Japan, by contrast, succeeded in adding only 6 fleet carriers across the entirety of the war. The industrial calculations Yamamoto had drafted during his studies in the United States decades earlier were being confirmed in real time. By late 1942 and throughout 1943, American output reached levels that even Yamamoto, who had warned his colleagues repeatedly, might have considered exaggerated had he not seen the data himself. Aircraft produced at a pace of one every few minutes, tank factories turning out roughly 150 vehicles a day, merchant ships sliding down the ways in a steady daily rhythm, and aircraft carriers appearing monthly as if from an assembly line.
Perhaps the most startling example was the Ford Willow Run facility. When Yamamoto toured Detroit in 1926, nothing like it existed. Yet, by the early 1940s, this enormous complex was rolling out B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate approaching 1 per hour. The entire plant had been conceived, built, and placed into operation in less time than it typically took Japan to finish erecting a single major industrial workshop. Intelligence summaries detailing these developments reached Yamamoto regularly. Officers who saw him reading them noted a subdued air of vindication. Every projection he had once outlined, projections dismissed by many in Tokyo as overly pessimistic, was unfolding at a speed that surpassed even his bleakest expectations. The mass production techniques he had studied in American automobile plants were now being applied to weapon systems that would steadily erode Japan's ability to continue the war. Oil shortages added another layer of inevitability. By 1943, the United States was generating around 1.7 billion barrels of petroleum each year. Japan, in contrast, possessed a strategic reserve of only about 50 million barrels, and that stockpile was dwindling rapidly. American submarines, increasing in both number and effectiveness, severed the maritime lifelines carrying oil from the southern resource territories to the home islands. "I warned them about the oil," Yamamoto wrote in a private note. "I showed them the numbers. They refused to accept them. Now our warships sit motionless for lack of fuel while American forces maneuver freely." During late 1942 and the opening months of 1943, Yamamoto led the combined fleet with the heavy awareness that the conflict's outcome had already been set by basic arithmetic. Letters discovered after the war, addressed to Chiyoko Kawai, revealed the portrait of a commander who felt not blindsided by events, but burdened by the knowledge that he had anticipated them long before they materialized. He likened his situation to that of a doctor caring for a patient whose prognosis had been declared hopeless. Treatment might relieve symptoms or delay the decline, he believed, but could not alter the fundamental condition. Japan's strategic weakness, in his view, stemmed from an industrial deficit so deep that even extraordinary bravery at sea or in the air could not compensate for it.
Observers within the fleet noticed a gradual intensification of his somber outlook. He became increasingly willing to expose himself to unnecessary hazards. On inspection tours of forward bases, he insisted on visiting the most vulnerable positions, almost as if seeking the fate that might release him from the responsibility of directing a campaign he believed was already beyond salvation. Admiral Matome Ugaki wrote in his diary that Yamamoto seemed indifferent to personal safety, and that he alone appeared to grasp the stark reality others preferred to ignore. The war's direction was no longer in doubt. The weight he carried, Ugaki implied, was not the burden of command itself, but the confirmation that his earlier warnings had unfolded exactly as he had predicted. In March 1943, Yamamoto drafted what would become his final major strategic assessment. Its conclusions were uncompromising. He reported that the United States had not only restored the losses incurred at Pearl Harbor, but had effectively replaced them twice over.
American pilot training programs were turning out more aviators in a single year than Japan had trained in the previous 2 decades. Industrial output in the United States continued to expand, while Japan's manufacturing capacity was steadily eroded by the prolonged strain of war. His final judgment was blunt. Armed conflict ultimately obeyed the principles of arithmetic rather than courage, and the numbers had shifted decisively and irreversibly against Japan. On 14 April 1943, American codebreakers uncovered a transmission containing a meticulous schedule for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's next inspection tour. The message, notable for its minute-by-minute breakdown, outlined his planned route from Rabaul to Balale Island, set for 4 days later. The precision of the itinerary reflected Yamamoto's own exacting habits, but it also created a vulnerability his enemies could exploit. The intercepted information set in motion Operation Vengeance, a mission that required authorization from the highest political and military authorities in Washington. Admiral Chester Nimitz voiced misgivings, worried that acting on such detailed intelligence might reveal the extraordinary success of American cryptanalysis. Despite these concerns, the U.S. leadership decided that eliminating Yamamoto was worth the risk. He was viewed as irreplaceable, one of the few Japanese commanders who understood with clarity and realism the scale of American industrial and technological superiority. It was a bitter irony. The American aircraft sent to kill him embodied the industrial model he had studied in the 1920s. Mass-produced fighters, each powered by Allison engines of roughly 1,600 horsepower, fueled by petroleum refined in quantities beyond Japan's reach. Their navigational methods drew upon equipment and training that Japanese air units struggled to match. Even the planning and coordination of the mission showcased the organizational sophistication of an industrial giant.
At 9:34 a.m., as Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G4M approached Bougainville, the American fighters struck. The bomber plunged into the jungle, and the wreckage was located the following day. Yamamoto's body was found still strapped into his seat, one hand resting on the guard of his ceremonial sword. Among his belongings was a recently composed poem acknowledging, in subdued language, that the future would belong not to nations defined solely by battlefield determination, but to those capable of sustaining vast industrial endeavors. His death removed the only senior Japanese figure who consistently recognized the impossibility of matching American production power. His successor, Admiral Minechi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's strategic insight and had no equivalent first-hand exposure to American manufacturing and research capacities. What followed mirrored Yamamoto's earlier predictions with striking fidelity. In 1940, he had warned that Japan might achieve early battlefield successes for 6 months, perhaps a year, before American resources shifted the war's trajectory decisively. His forecast proved more accurate than his colleagues realized. Once the United States fully mobilized, the industrial gap widened dramatically. The U.S. replaced aircraft and ships faster than Japan could repair them. American oil supplies were effectively limitless, Japan's dwindled rapidly. Advances in radar, cryptanalysis, and electronics created a technological gulf Japan could not bridge. Mass production techniques, already on display in the factories Yamamoto had toured 2 decades earlier, allowed the United States to outproduce Japan by staggering ratios. By 1944, American industry was manufacturing in a single month more weapons, aircraft, and vehicles than Japan produced in an entire year. Facilities such as the enormous River Rouge complex, which Yamamoto had studied when it was already impressive, now operated at wartime intensity, turning out military equipment at a pace that dwarfed Japan's entire industrial system.
The closing months of the conflict offered the most dramatic confirmation of Yamamoto's warnings. In August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki displayed a level of scientific integration and industrial investment beyond anything Japan had ever imagined feasible. The Manhattan Project alone consumed approximately $2 billion, more than Japan's total wartime military expenditure,
and engaged around 130,000 personnel across multiple top-secret sites. Its power needs exceeded those of many Japanese cities. Even its delivery mechanism, the B-29 Superfortress, represented an industrial feat. Each bomber cost more than an entire Japanese destroyer and was produced in quantities Japan could not hope to rival. In the end, the war unfolded almost exactly as Yamamoto had anticipated. His years of studying American factories, oil refineries, and research centers had given him a perspective unmatched within Japan's leadership. The empire marched toward a conflict it could not win, while Yamamoto, its most perceptive strategist, died aboard an aircraft built by an industrial base he had long urged his countrymen to understand. In the closing stages of the Pacific War, an unexpected voice reached Japanese radios. Captain Ellis M. Zacharias, who years earlier had played poker with Yamamoto during the Admiral's Washington assignment, broadcast directly to the Japanese public in polished, idiomatic Japanese. His message was blunt and deeply personal. He reminded listeners that the catastrophe engulfing their nation had been foreseen by one of their own senior commanders. Admiral Yamamoto understood exactly where this path would end, Zacharias declared. He visited our refineries, our research centers, our mills. He recognized what they meant. He warned you, but his warnings went unanswered. In the years after the war, when scholars compiled production figures from both sides, the scale of American output revealed just how precisely Yamamoto had judged the industrial balance. From 1941 to 1945, U.S. factories delivered close to 300,000 aircraft. Japan produced slightly more than 76,000. American shipyards turned out 141 aircraft carriers, an assembly line of floating airfields unmatched in history, while Japan completed only 16. 8 American battleships were launched in that period, compared with 2 from Japanese yards. Submarine production showed a similar disparity, 203 for the United States and 126 for Japan. Merchant shipbuilding offered the most dramatic contrast of all, with the United States generating nearly 34 million tons of new cargo vessels, a figure roughly 8 times Japan's wartime construction. These statistics were not abstract measures. They represented the industrial force Yamamoto had seen in person 2 decades earlier, a machine of production no resource-strained nation could confront indefinitely. Following Japan's capitulation, occupation officials examined Yamamoto's personal archive, materials he evidently never intended to be made public. Inside were drafts of unsent letters, private memoranda, and fragments of personal reflections. Together, they formed an intimate record of a commander who had understood the war's futility long before the first shot was fired. Among these papers was a never-delivered letter to Emperor Hirohito dated December 1, 1941. In it, Yamamoto expressed a sense of failure so candid it likely would not have survived official scrutiny. He confessed that he had been unable to halt a conflict he considered strategically hopeless. The letter described, in matter-of-fact terms, the immense productive capabilities of the United States, its oil reserves, which he regarded as practically infinite, its capacity to expand weapons manufacturing to levels beyond Japan's imagination, and the determination he expected the American people to show once aroused. "I can promise 6 months of favorable results," he wrote. "After that point, calculation takes control. We are 70 million without resources attempting to defeat 130 million empowered by vast supplies. The conclusion is predetermined." Another document, composed shortly before the mission that ended his life, was addressed to Admiral Mainichi Koga, soon to assume command of the combined fleet. This letter, more sober than despairing, attempted to prepare Koga for the reality awaiting him. Yamamoto explained that Japan's material disadvantage would overwhelm even the most disciplined seamanship.
"The fleet you are set to command is already outweighed," he wrote. "Our sailors are brave, our aviators skilled, but quantities will decide the contest. Each ship we lose will be replaced several times over by the enemy. Each aircraft destroyed will be matched many times in return. Our fuel reserves diminish with every engagement, while they draw from oceans of petroleum. I have seen their industrial capacity directly. You will face not merely a nation, but a vast continental workshop. Continue the fight for as long as duty demands, but be under no illusion. This struggle's end is unavoidable." The great irony of Yamamoto's career becomes clear through these documents. His legacy was shaped not only by his dramatic death in 1943, but by a contradiction that defined his final years. The officer who most accurately understood American power was compelled to wage war against it. The strategist who insisted that Japan could not prevail was tasked with crafting the very operation, an audacious surprise attack, that ensured the war would widen rather than end quickly. And the admiral who hoped to prevent Japan from provoking the United States was ultimately responsible for delivering the blow that roused its industrial might to full and devastating intensity. When word spread among Yamamoto's American acquaintances that he had been the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, the reaction was one of genuine disbelief. Many who had known him as a student in the United States struggled to reconcile the quiet, inquisitive officer they remembered with the man now credited with initiating the Pacific War. Professor Theodore McNally, who had taught Yamamoto during his Harvard years, remarked that no foreign student in his classes had shown a deeper grasp of American production methods. He toured our steel plants, studied our oil distribution systems, followed our assembly line techniques with an engineer's intensity. He probably understood the mechanics of U.S. industry better than the average American executive. For him to have overseen the attack must have been agony. But Yamamoto had lived within a military and political environment where dissent from assigned duty was nearly unimaginable. The imperial system tolerated no open refusal from an officer of his stature. To decline a directive would have terminated his career, undermined the chain of command, and, perhaps more painfully for him, signaled abandonment at a moment he believed his country needed clear-headed leadership. Unable to prevent Japan from drifting into confrontation, he attempted instead to shape early operations in the hope that rapid victories might compel diplomatic negotiations before the overwhelming industrial imbalance sealed Japan's fate. In the decades following Japan's surrender, scholars within the former imperial military re-examined Yamamoto's memoranda and speeches with a mixture of astonishment and regret. They found that he had foreseen, with unusual accuracy, the strategic trajectory of the war, the devastating consequences of attacking a nation with far greater productive assets, the speed at which the United States would reorganize its industries, and the futility of relying on morale to offset material shortages.
Admiral Shoji Toyoda, who oversaw the Navy's final campaigns, later spoke candidly about the warnings they had ignored. He recognized realities that the rest of us refused to consider, Toyoda admitted. He had stood inside American factories and measured their scale himself. We dismissed his caution as defeatism. We clung to the belief that spiritual strength could compensate for a lack of factories, fuel, and raw materials. He understood that courage cannot rewrite mathematics. At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, one of the strongest advocates for war against the United States, offered a similarly sober reflection. Admiral Yamamoto told us without ambiguity that victory could not be achieved, he testified. He knew the United States intimately. He had seen their universities, their manufacturers, their sense of national purpose. We believed he had returned too influenced by the West. Only afterward did we realize he had simply described the reality we refused to see. The deeper tragedy was systemic rather than personal. Japan's senior leadership, across both Army and Navy, had effectively marginalized the only high-ranking officer who had undertaken a sustained empirical study of American capabilities. Instead of grounding strategy in measurable indicators, they elevated national mythology and wartime enthusiasm, dismissing Yamamoto's assessments as unnecessarily gluey. Ironically, it was in the American Navy that Yamamoto earned a level of professional esteem seldom matched in his own service. Several U.S. officers who had known him before the conflict reacted to the announcement of his death with mixed emotions: relief that the mission had succeeded, but also a sense of loss for a man they privately respected. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who authorized the operation that led to Yamamoto's interception, later reflected that Yamamoto had been one of the few Japanese leaders who fully comprehended America's industrial power and psychological outlook. "He had studied our strengths in detail and understood how we would fight," Nimitz remarked. Removing him was essential in military terms, but on a personal level, it was unfortunate. Commander Ellis Zacharias, who had played poker with Yamamoto during the mid-1920s, penned one of the most striking assessments in the post-war years. To him, Yamamoto represented a visionary whose caution had been overlooked in Tokyo. He understood that the age of modern war was determined not by ancient codes or heroic sentiment, but by engines, factories, and the capacity to replace what is lost. He warned his nation not to provoke a country built on industrial abundance. Captain Edwin Layton, the intelligence officer whose code-breaking work helped orchestrate the ambush that brought Yamamoto's aircraft down, offered a poignant reflection. "In eliminating him, we removed the one senior Japanese commander who might have forced a more rational appraisal of the war's direction. Without his moderating influence, decision-making fell into the hands of men who trusted ideology more than data. The result was a conflict prolonged at tremendous human cost."
Public disclosures in the 1970s revealed the depth of Yamamoto's study of the United States many years before the Pacific War began. His intelligence assessments from the mid-1920s, long buried in archival files, showed a level of quantitative precision that astonished later historians. In those reports, he projected potential American wartime aircraft output to within roughly 10% of the nation's eventual maximum production rate. His evaluations of petroleum capacity were even closer, diverging by only about 5% from the numbers reached during the conflict. He estimated steel production within a margin of 15%, and shipbuilding potential within 20%. These figures were not arrived at casually. His approach combined direct observation with laborious calculation. Yamamoto walked factory floors with a notebook in hand, recording square footage, employee density, workflow efficiency, and throughput rates. He diagrammed transportation routes, coal and oil supply chains, and regional infrastructure linkages. Using only slide rules and meticulous arithmetic, he generated projections that decades later would prove more reliable than sophisticated computer-based forecasting models. Among his many assessments, one prediction stood out for its prescience: the political and emotional repercussions of a sudden blow against Pearl Harbor. In a 1940 memorandum, he argued that such an attack might succeed in the moment, but would produce a strategic calamity. "If struck," he wrote, "the American public will mobilize with a forcefulness that cannot be checked." His warning was dismissed by many officials who assumed the United States lacked the will to fight. Yamamoto's career, therefore, carries a lesson that reaches beyond the Japanese wartime experience. At its heart, it demonstrates the danger of embracing comforting illusions at the expense of numerical fact. He had examined the data personally, toured the industrial centers, and understood the scale of U.S. resources. Yet his conclusions were overshadowed by political ideology and nationalist confidence. In one of his final letters to Chiyoko Kawai, written only days before the mission that resulted in his death, He expressed a quiet resignation. "I discharged my duty as I interpreted it. I presented the evidence, production capacity, fuel reserves, the scale of their industry. Leaders chose war regardless. In command, I could only attempt to limit the magnitude of our defeat." He ended that note with a brief poem, part reflection and part farewell, attempting to reconcile the courage expected of a military commander with the arithmetic he knew to be decisive. Soft rain in Texas, iron becoming fate. Valor breaks before numbers. Yamamoto died acutely aware that his forecasts had unfolded with unnerving exactness. The 6-month window of Japanese advantage that he had predicted played out almost to the day, beginning with the Pearl Harbor assault in December 1941 and closing with the reversal at Midway in June 1942. After that, the industrial surge he had warned about arrived with relentless consistency. The United States mobilized precisely as he had anticipated, methodically, massively, and with unwavering resolve. His earlier travels in America, studying petroleum engineering at Harvard, observing manufacturing processes in Detroit, examining oil networks in Washington, and surveying industrial installations across multiple regions had given him a sophisticated understanding of American power. He recognized not only the country's active production, but also the enormous capacity lying dormant until wartime mobilization. To Yamamoto, modern war was ultimately an equation involving steel output, shipping tonnage, aviation fuel, and industrial labor. Not a contest decided solely by bravery or tactical brilliance. The factories he inspected as a young officer later produced the materiel that dismantled the empire he served. The oil fields he analyzed fueled the fleets that closed in on Japan. The assembly lines he once praised for their efficiency created the bombers that devastated Japanese cities. His notebooks, filled with careful measurements and extrapolations, became, years later, records of predictions fulfilled line by line. Yet, his legacy is not of simple failure. It is rather the story of a man willing to present unwelcome truths in a political environment that valued ideological loyalty over analytical rigor. He saw what others refused to consider, measured what others preferred to ignore, and cautioned against consequences that no one wished to contemplate. His tragedy was not poor judgment, but insight disregarded. In the end, Yamamoto's American education taught him a lesson both profound and unforgiving. In industrial warfare, numerical reality sets the boundaries of fate. He calculated the trajectory of the conflict, recognized the narrow window of early Japanese opportunity, and understood that once the United States mobilized fully, resistance would become untenable. His prediction held true down to the calendar. Isoroku Yamamoto thus emerges as one of the most poignant figures of the Second World War, a strategist compelled to wage a war he privately believed was unwinnable, ultimately killed by the same industrial strength he had long warned against, and vindicated only in the aftermath of the nation he sought to defend.